There we go. All right, folks. So I gave you homework of to divide, like, look at the 10 commandments in a big chunk. I emailed it out to all of you, and I was curious if any of you actually did the marking up and dividing and seeing where you thought the commandments should go just from rote memory. Did any of you do that?
Yeah, I did
Yeah,
it.
I tried.
Okay.
I only got 9. That's because I did.
First I tried on my own,
Yeah,
and I figured if you're going to number them, it's easier to start at the bottom and work your way back up because the
that's a good idea.
commands are all a pretty clear cut. So if you start not
Yeah, I should have done.
your neighbor, as number 10, and then 9 backwards, go 9, 8, 7, 7. Then you get back up to the first part, which are really all of the sort of God talking to the people. But then all of a sudden, left over in the middle is this funny statement: honor your father and mother so you can live a long time. And that didn't seem to fit either place. And that'd be number 11. Well, you sort of got to sandwich it into something. So it was hard. It was hard to try to do it.
The one of them has I have a diagram in my Bible. So the Catholics have the first 3 are 1, 1, 1. They lump all those together, but they call it, they just say it. And so that's how they figure out 10. If they didn't do that, they would only have 8. So the Protestants call the first part a prologue, and that's number 1.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my problem, that I was thinking like a Protestant.
Yeah. Mary Ellen?
Well, I was really interested in the commentary in the Bible because it talks about honoring your mother and father, but it mentions that it's a metaphor for the covenant between God and Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And that was totally new to information to me, because whenever the 10 commandments have been read or studied or whatever, it's always been taken literally, your mother and your father. So
yeah, a lot of people, I think most people take it literally.
Yes. So that was an interesting thing in the commentary for me.
Yeah. And as I remember learning the 10 Commandments as a child, the idea was honor your father and mother so they could live a long time. But it's not honor your father and mother so you can live a long time. And I thought, well, that's right. When you're old and decrepit, somebody's got to take care of you.
How does you live a long time? I guess if you don't honor your father and your mother, you're going to get wet.
Yeah.
Your mother and father behave and do what they say. Yeah. Put a whole new spin on it for me.
Yeah. So any other observations before we kind of walk through and kind of pull out what we think each of these means? Any other thoughts or reflections of how to break it up or any of that? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, you mentioned last week the creation story and the water encompassing everything. And it shows up here in verse 4, where you're talking about in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. So your comment last week just fit right in there when I read that.
Oh, that is an eagle eye observation. 100% that same image is coming into play. And we think of the earth as being an orb, with like the core in the center and lava underneath, but they imagined water underneath the earth. So yes, that 100% plays into that cosmology.
Is this the graven image? I wondered, is that the origin of not doing any figure drawing or figure painting? You know, in the forbidden to do that in Jewish artists. They don't do it until much later. Like,
so I am unaware of that being a thing in Jewish art. It may be, but I'm more familiar with the Islamic tradition of not depicting
images. Yeah.
Or yeah, they do geometric art, but not figure-based art. Or
well, I'm already about Muslim painting, so it must be.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it comes from something like their version of this, yes.
Because I think until like the 19th century, they probably, yeah.
So let's start to walk through, and I'm gonna break apart some of where some of the divisions are, and just like some of how I'm gonna bring in as much as possible of like different understandings of different pieces of this. And one of the big questions is actually, what is the first commandment?
Yeah.
That is one that's actually fairly interesting, who breaks it apart and who keeps that first chunk together. Because I actually found, or I was a little bit late because I found something and I was trying to get some more information about it. There was even one source that did it even differently than I thought. So starting in verse 1 as we have it. So noting that the Protestants tend to follow the Jewish, kind of how the Jewish Torah is broken up. By and large, when the Reformation happened, they tried to match the Jewish tradition, seeing that that was likely less adulterated than some of the Catholic understandings at the time. So the way that we see the verses broken apart is by and large what the Jewish tradition has. If you do not specifically have a Catholic Bible will do this slightly differently. So, but the interesting one is that the Talmud, which is the writing about scripture, that the Jewish interpretation, actually has the first commandment as being, I am the Lord your God, full stop. Which is an interesting choice. It's like the first commandment is, I am your God.
Well, yeah, it's God speaking directly, and the rest of it is supposed to be Moses, isn't it?
No, all of this is supposed to be from the.
Okay.
For a while, going forward, this is all going to be like Moses will be relaying this, but it's all of the commandments are theoretically in God's voice and then repeated by Moses.
Oh, okay. But this one doesn't sound like it's repeated. It sounds more direct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Mary Ellen, did I see like an almost hand there?
No, I was just adjusting myself though.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. I'll go in here. All right. If the Hebrew Talmud says, I am the Lord your God is the first commandment, and Moses is repeating them, he could be adding the explanation as to what the understanding of the Lord your God is when he's passing these on to the other people. I can see that, where it can be broken up with, this is the commandment, I am the Lord your God, but then Moses is interpreting it and helping the people understand what that means.
So this is the interesting part, is what comes after is understood to be the second commandment.
Yeah, interesting. Now I see it very okay.
But that said, the Talmud is the only one that does that, evidently. And so I think the most common version in the Protestant Bible, in the Torah, the first commandment is often read as, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And that is kind of like the complete, I'm the Lord your God. I'm the one who did this. Nothing comes before me. And that is often seen as commandment number 1. So
the prologue.
The prologue?
Yeah.
Well, if you take it as a prologue, you don't exactly get to number 10 is the interesting part. And I mean, that's some of the discussion is it is called the 10 Commandments in other places in the Bible. And so this is where we get the understanding that there's supposed to be 10. Yeah. The question is, they didn't number them. Like, we know they're supposed to be, so where, like, how do we break it apart? And so,
Protestants between other gods and idols. I thought those went together, but other gods is the second one, and idols is the third, and the fourth is the divine name. So they split that up. Same too.
Yeah. So there are, I believe it is the Catholic understanding of the 10 Commandments that groups, you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not make an image, and they group all of the, like, don't put anything before God. They group all of that together.
Yes.
Which to me actually makes a sort of sense. Like, don't have any God before me, and this is how you will do it, kind of a thing.
How you won't do it.
Or you won't, yeah. So let's take this piece at a time, though. What does it to you mean to have no other gods before God? Like, in the ancient world, we've kind of talked about how this is kind of still a polytheistic world. They're bumping up against other tribes that are definitely polytheistic. But that is not our understanding today. I don't feel like we have to, I mean, we have other religions that understand God in different ways, but I don't feel like we have the same, like, we don't have our friends pressuring us to worship other gods. So how do we understand this commandment today? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, we don't have a polytheistic world today in the sense of other acknowledged gods such as they had in the Hebrew times that they were to definitely avoid. But in today's society, we have greed, we have money, we have status, we have reputation, we have all of these other gods that many people pursue. And what this is saying to me is, in your pursuit of all of that, don't lose your focus on God. That, and I'll tell a little story. My father worked for a company in Saginaw, and when he was 62 years old, he was fired. And the reason that he was fired that was given to him is, and I'm going to use some language here. It was that he was too much of a goddamn Christian. And our family took great pride in that he took his principles of godliness and fairness and rightness and not cheating and, not whatever. And he chose to be a goddamn Christian. So, in our society, I think we have other gods that people get caught up in worshiping and lose focus on our God.
So it's almost, in that sense, like, what it means to worship something is almost to put it as your highest priority in your life. And that if you look at things that way, there's a lot of worship going on, and not a lot of it is towards God, whether it's so what are some examples of things then that people put first and foremost in their life?
Money. More and more and more and more and more. There's never an end.
You're right.
More money than you could possibly need or use.
I think a growing one that I see, or that I'm very concerned with, is basically internet attention, because now fame is almost accessible to everybody. So many people are now chasing that kind of doing things to get clout on the internet, and it's like there's almost an internet deity called the algorithm that people are very much always in pursuit of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, very many very young people.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so, if you talk about God having power over your life, if you pay attention to him, the internet seems to have power over some people's lives more than certainly Christianity does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other examples you all can think of? Yeah, Gary?
Well, the radical or extreme climate change people, that has been referred to as a religion, to the point that it's gotten so that it because it's not faith, a lot of it is not based on any kind of facts and so forth, and yet these people are extremely emotional and dedicated, committed to the issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like that could be one example, but like there's a lot of political agendas that people get so wrapped up in that it becomes their entire personality and identity. So yeah, thinking about like what it means to get so wrapped up into politics and social issues that you lose sight of everything else. Mm-hmm.
Is that almost like worshiping a god?
I mean, so I was thinking about this the other day when I was putting the bulletin together. Is we have our the prayer that we have right before we or right after the call to worship, and like the word worship is often used, and I was thinking to myself, like, what does it actually mean to worship something in this day and age? Because I think what we do in like our church services, like we call it our worship services, but it's like when someone says, oh, you're worshiping something, it doesn't conjure the same image. So it's like, what does it even mean to like bow down and worship something?
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. I was thinking about the phrase, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Fear is awe, I think. So if you're bowing down, it's the acknowledgement, I think, that God is much greater than you are. Maybe for some people, money is the same way, but we can't become God, but we can. Some people could get rich.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thinking also about political issues that become overpowering. And I also think hate almost becomes something people are consumed with, an individual or a movement.
Mm-hmm.
The opposite of doing something for good, it also becomes political.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Did you say hate?
I did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, along with what Joe just said, I was reading that the United States is gearing up, police departments are gearing up in anticipation of hate crimes being a response to what's happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip. And, they're preparing, synagogues are preparing. And, that dedication isn't a strong enough word, but following what Joe was saying, and I was hearing hate, it becomes overpowering, and that becomes everything that they're geared toward doing. You know, whoever the object of their hate issue is. I mean, it could be the Ku Klux Klan back in the day, or it could be the suicide bombers that we know exist today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like connecting this around because to like what Sue you were saying about what is it that gives us a sense of awe? And I feel like awe comes with a sense of humbleness of the like I am giving reverence to something that I see as bigger than me. If you connect that back to like what we're talking about with fear, I think some people are humbled and awed by the tragedies that are like beyond our control. And that's where some of that connects around of do we turn to like hate and fear because we're in awe of this situation that not like good awe, but like just that sense of like, oh my gosh, this is so beyond me. And in that way, giving that sense of awe and attention and just humbleness in the sight of these things can kind of make that so some of these issues, some of these things become first and foremost in our mind.
Well, it doesn't feel quite the same.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't feel, I mean, the fear of God doesn't feel the same as as I feel about what's going on in the world today, which is such, there's so much horror. Horror is mixed into it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so beyond what we ever thought that people could do. Of course, they've been doing it all along. We just didn't know, but just awful.
So carrying this on to the next part of this. So we talked about what it means to have no other gods, to not worship any other gods. Actually, I'm going to pause here for a funny interpretation. This is a little bit of a more lighthearted note. So when I was in India, I had many of the locals in the town coming up to me and telling me that they were Christian as well. And I was like, okay, that's great. And I was kind of curious what they meant by this. And evidently a traveling preacher came to town. He preached the gospel. He baptized a lot of people. He taught them the 10 commandments. And they all remembered the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. And they followed along. The thing is, they understood this in a different way. Because as it turns out, the traveling preacher that comes to town and does a ritual with the people is actually very common in India. And often the traveling preacher has some kind of ritual associated with their particular god, and the locals participate, and then he carries on to the next town, which is exactly what this Christian preacher did. And what they understood is to follow the Christian God, they just had to put Jesus at the highest point of the altar. So there's no other gods before Jesus, but there's many after him. And it's like really fascinating how like the two were not seen as contradictory, that they considered themselves Christian because they were baptized, because they followed Jesus, but they also still followed all the Hindu gods that they grew up with. And so this is where there is room for interpretation in what they saw as important. And I found it funny because the Christian preacher never came back. He thought he saved like this town full of people and converted them all to Christianity, and they really hadn't changed. They just made sure to say the Lord's Prayer and Jesus was on the top. Like, that's it.
Now, are there gods? There's a Asian museum in Paris, so they have a lot of the gods where there are all sorts of arms, you know, with that kind of. Well, is that Hindu or Buddhist? Yeah, okay.
Hindu, yeah. Hindu. Yeah. Yep. So that actually connects us to the second verse, which evidently they were not paying attention to. But it says that you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or in the earth below, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I am the Lord your God, I am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generations for those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations for those who love me and keep my commandments. So that is either the second part of the first commandment, or I think in most of our Bibles has it as the second commandment. So what do you think of this second commandment? Like, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make another god.
But it sounds like a lot of stuff where it's if you do it, you're good, and if you don't, you're condemned. You know, bang bang. That shows up a lot in the Bible. The threat of annihilation.
Yeah, so this is the only one that has that kind of threat to it. The other ones just have commandments. This is the one that says it doesn't specify what the punishment is, only that there will be punishment. And it's not just on you, but it's on your children and your children's children and your children's children. What do we think about this?
Sounds pretty vengeful.
Well, I think that's one of the commandments that has been questioned a lot, whether being sinful is passed down and your children are punished also. That's very controversial. I thought it had been sort of thrown away. You know, it must have meant something else. But it's true that if you have, practically, if you have, it's very hard to overcome if you have bad parents.
And
it does affect you, but they didn't know that. So
that is actually how I personally have come to see this. Is not there. We've talked about the difference between prescriptive rules of, if this happens, this is going to happen, versus descriptive rules of, this happens and then we've also observed these things happen, and we're kind of describing the situation but maybe putting it in prescriptive terms. And this is one where, like you said, Sue, we don't get to choose our parents, and the flaws of our parents affect us. And it's one of those that we see how trauma continues on generation, especially if you're not reflective of it. Children tend to repeat habits of their parents. And if you're not dealing with things, even in situations of abuse, one of the things that makes me so sad is when you see that someone is being abusive to their children, and then you hear their story and you realize they were abused as children as well. And you see how this kind of just keeps on until someone makes an intentional change often. And that is often how, it's not that sin is carried on, but children are taught and then they replicate.
A lot of amazingly creative people have been seriously traumatized when they're young. And I keep reading stories about them. There's a poet at Columbia, I think, it couldn't be MFA program. It was written up in the New York Times, who I think his grandparents kidnapped him because his father was Black and raised him. I mean, it's just and beat him and threw him against the wall and all sorts of things. And he ended up pulling himself together, going to school, going to college, getting maybe even a PhD, and then, and becoming a poet. I mean, it's just, to me, amazing that they don't always turn out to be awful like their parents.
They don't. Yeah.
But they are impacted, and it's never goes away.
So what's also interesting in this cause effect situation is that the bad stuff lasts to the third and fourth generation, But the good stuff, if you honor me, that lasts to the 1,000 generation.
Okay.
Like, what do we think of this distinction that sins are like a 3 or 4, but like if you honor me, that blessing lasts for so much longer.
That's good.
Uh-huh. For me, it's a hope that at least the goodness, the light, and the hope that we put into the world sticks around longer than our flaws, hopefully. Hopefully. So, one last question before we jump to the next one. So we already talked about like what it means to kind of worship other things other than God. Do we find that like don't make a graven image, like don't make an idol? Is that, do we group that into the like we make idols, not like physical idols, but we make certain inanimate things the most important thing? Do we group those together in our mind, or does it mean something different to make an idol out of something?
I think they were talking about those little things you have in your house, weren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, and there is a lot of that. A lot of Christians. I mean, like in Mexico, they have shrines, and they have, well, they're not graven images, but they do. The Virgin Mary is almost made into. Well, that's not Judaism, is it? Okay.
No. I mean, so that actually is an interesting question of like images in church, which has gone back and forth throughout the generations. So a lot of Catholic saints were originally indigenous gods, especially when it comes to like Celtic mythology. A lot of like British inspired saints, Saint Bridget is one of them. Bridget is a Celtic goddess turned into a Christian saint.
Oh.
And a lot of the saints, they think, have this kind of interesting relationship where some of them were the pagan gods. And so there was a way for it to be kind of, Christianity came into the area and they didn't entirely upend everything. And one way you could get buy-in is like, oh, well, that's not a god, that's just a saint. And it gets incorporated in.
The cathedrals have saints, all, they have statues of all the saints, either inside or outside.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, yeah.
So just to finish the thought, to like bring it around to like our tradition, when the Reformation happened, and especially Calvinistic traditions, they went through and destroyed so many images because of this commandment. They burned tapestries, they desecrated like mural paintings, which in the medieval churches, like pre-Reformation, literacy was so low that often the images were how people learned Bible stories. But because the Reformation coincided with increased literacy, they all of a sudden became iconoclastic, literally destroying the images in churches. So you would know a Protestant church because it would be stark, it would be barren, and for a long, long time, Protestant churches did not have images. So they kind of, it's interesting how this even has gone back and forth in our history. But Mary Ellen, I know you want to jump in.
You mentioned what I was going to bring up, that
okay.
Before literacy was common, the walls of the churches, and when you travel overseas, you go to Russia, you go to these different places there, I mean, every inch of every wall is covered with some kind of a mural, whatever, but they are teaching stories, how people were able to keep things in the forefront because they knew the image and they knew the story that went with it. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that, and that's the point that I was going to bring up too.
Yeah. Yeah, Larry?
But in a way, they are also worshipped. Some of the icons, with a silver plate over the painting, or the statue of the Virgin Mary is actually a focus of worship.
Yeah, it has become that, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I even find interesting, and this is one that I'm gonna level at some sects of Protestantism even. A lot of these paintings on European churches is where a lot of Christian iconography came from, just like our visual language. Jesus being depicted in a long white robe with long hair comes from those churches. Jesus likely did not look like that. There's actually, I've seen some interesting discussion from not ethnographers, from people who are studying ancient text, and like, what did, like, with the question literally, like, what would Jesus have worn? And there's one article that said he probably had a short tunic, which went to like mid thighs, because of some description, and there's an association that like Jesus was actually pretty shabbily dressed and basically walked around in what would have been a nightgown. But he very unlikely did he have a full floor-length robe. It would be considered actually against some of the Levitical law to have him with the long hair we kind of associate with Jesus. So he likely had short cropped hair and a little thigh-length tunic with just like a simple belt. And every time I see people try to give like a different image to like the very classic like painting of Jesus that was in like 80% of Sunday school rooms, there's a certain point where people are in an uproar. But all of this relates to iconography, not actually like evidence of like what Jesus might have actually looked like. But there's still this sense of we are very attached to what we think Jesus looks like. To the point where it's like, has Jesus become an idol for us? Which is a weird question to ask.
It is an interesting question, but we also talk about, it seems to me that often Jesus is interchangeable with God. That I've noticed that sometimes you do that, Chris, and yeah, I'm always startled because that was not the tradition I grew up in. And but a lot of people do that, so I don't.
And this is where many Jews and many Muslims say that Christianity is not actually monotheistic.
Yeah.
And technically we're not. We are a qualified monotheistic religion. Because we have this whole Trinity thing, but so many people think that our worship of Jesus violates this commandment.
I don't worship this.
Many Christians do. I that's kind of, it's, anyways. I'm looking at the time. We've been talking a lot about the first two commandments. Let's carry on. Because there's still a lot that I think is valuable here, and I don't want to miss it. So the next I am going to go with the traditional understanding of these when I number them from this point on. So this kind of matches with at least what my Bible says. So commandment 3, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not hold anyone guiltless for the misuse of his name. So what were you told as a kid this one meant? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I had an experience with that. One of my elementary schools that I worked at in Birmingham had a Jewish principal, which, neither here nor there, but a lot of Jewish children. And 5th and 6th grade boys were taking Jesus' name in vain. They just were using it as an expletive. And I wouldn't allow it in my classroom. And my principal called me on the carpet for it. And I said, I'm very sorry, but this goes against my religious principles. I will not be subject to listening to these children who don't know what they're doing, what they're saying. They've just been caught up in this. But it was just common vernacular at that point. But I won the round because I said, I'm a Christian and I will not allow flagrant use of Jesus' name in my classroom.
Mhm.
And, we hear that so much in society where it's just used as an expletive. And I cringe every time I hear it.
Mhm.
So, that's my story. I don't know what point I made, but
Mhm.
that's the story.
Yeah, but that's one aspect of the interpretation of this is like God's name, and as Christians we put Jesus up in that category too. Don't use my name as like a swear word, basically. Don't use it as an explicitive if that's not what it's there for.
Well, it could be a curse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I don't, yeah.
Yeah, Larry?
Birmingham stopped playing Christmas carols over street loudspeakers due to objections of the Jewish people. And I had a Jewish associate in my office, and she insisted we not play Christmas carols in the office.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the clinic stopped having Christmas trees and things like that, which I think is very appropriate.
These weren't allowed to have any Christmas anything in the schools in Birmingham. This was in the 70s. You could not have a Christmas tree. You could not have a mitten tree. We did Christian, we did Hanukkah, we did Kwanzaa. We were trying to touch base with all of them, and it was all banned. And at one point, an assistant superintendent came in, and all the staff had shirts on, Christmas shirts, or a pin that because they couldn't dictate what we wore. But I mean, the schools were just void of any acknowledgement. And even the Christmas holiday party that was wonderful before Christmas was changed into a winter party in January, and nobody came except administrators and retirees. Nobody went to the holiday party, no, the Christmas party. I'm sorry, the Winter Wonderland party, when they take away the wonderful, wonderful staff holiday party.
So what's interesting to me is seeing, like all of this I hear you all talking about is grappling with the fact that we are an intercultural society now. This is a reality, and I can't see a way that we're going to pedal back from this. This is our world today. We are, there's many religions within this area. And what's fascinating to me now is, I hear your all stories of like, don't play Christmas carols, like don't wear Christmas stuff, or like don't put it up. That's actually been, a lot of that's been actually walked back now. But what we have in replacement is that Christmas now is seen as a non-religious holiday in many ways. That people who are not Christians celebrate Christmas because it's seen as a cultural holiday.
Yes.
And so,
Indians.
with my question being, so in order to get Christmas to be like able to be publicly celebrated, we actually decentralize the religious element of it. And I'm going back to the third commandment here is like, don't misuse the Lord's name. And I think we kind of tend to associate like, don't misuse like God's essence, like our religious practices, like don't put it out willy-nilly, like keep it sacred, keep it holy. And some of the things I hear now is people lamenting about the secularization of Christmas. But that was almost the trade-off we made to have it be a publicly celebrated holiday. So what do we do? But I'm going to keep us rolling because I think we could, I mean, we can, if we are actually, I'll pause right now. So we have about 8 minutes left. We can powerhouse the rest of the way through, or we can spend a second week on these 10 commandments and kind of come back to them, since we're kind of dwelling on a lot of these issues. What do you all think?
Second week.
That's fine.
That's fine.
Fine.
Okay. So then I'm not going to push us too hard. We also, because there's also, if you notice, Exodus 20 doesn't end with the 10 commandments. There's a little, we start to get into the other part at the end of it. So, so let's wrap up with then commandment number 4. As I don't know if we're going to be able to settle on anything with Christmas. But
no.
This
You put Christ back at the Christmas?
Well, it's like one of the things, if to put Christ back into Christmas, that's one of those we would take it back into church, and we would once again have to pull it back from a cultural holiday, which means it doesn't get to be in the stores as much. It doesn't get to be in the schools as much. We go back to kind of what Mary Ellen said. That's the trade-off of being an intercultural society. Do we want Jesus to be centered, or do we want to be able to publicly celebrate? That's kind of what we're offered.
We don't have a choice, Chris. Commercialism has taken over. We would never be able to get Walmart to back off from the sales that they make during Christmas in every fashion. So we really don't have a choice.
No. So the question is, how do we keep it holy then? Gonna let that one linger of we can't always control the culture, but we get to choose how we respond to it. But quick note about that, don't take the Lord's name in vain. The likely original understanding of this isn't using God as like a swear word or like an explicitive or a curse word, any of those. It is likely understood as don't make vows or like commitments, don't sign contracts with the Lord's name unless you plan on following through with it. That's the second part of like the Lord won't hold anyone guiltless. Once again, being a largely illiterate society, and therefore your contracts were verbal, if you swore by God, then God is going to hold you to your contract. And if you break that contract, the Lord will punish you. So that's actually likely one of the original interpretations, is actually, if you use the Lord's name to make a vow, do it. Do not do that lightly. We see later on, Jesus says, don't make vows because it's too heavy of a price to pay. We read that in the Gospels. Jesus says, just don't do it. Here it's saying, don't do it willy-nilly.
Well, when the president when people are sworn into office, they put their hand on the Bible.
And they still do that today. You have a choice. Like Jews will swear by the Torah. There's atheists who have sworn by other things that they hold as valuable. But yes, the oath of office is still largely done on a Bible. All right. So the last one that we'll end with today and we'll pick up next time is one of the few positive. There's a mixture of don't do this and do this. And this is one of those in the positive. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your sons or daughters, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor the foreigners residing in your towns. For 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So what do we think about this one?
Good idea.
Huh?
It's a good idea.
Yeah?
Yeah. I was just thinking about how you get your animals to, so Stop running.
This is a world largely without pets, but with labor animals. So it's like, don't make your horse and your mule plow the field. They get to rest too.
The flocks.
Yeah.
Don't they include the flocks, the sheep and the goats and the camels?
Yeah. Yeah, Mary Ellen, then Larry.
Well, to me, it's common sense. No physical body, human, animal, whatever, can go every day at full speed expectations. That's what slaves had to do. That's what, prisoners in early Russia had to do. And they all ended up dying early, and the quality of what they were able to do diminished. And it's common sense that bodies need a day of rest. And so using the Lord's creation as a comparison interests me, because, and this is totally off subject, we don't have to go there, but I wonder what the Lord did on the eighth day. So anyway, we don't have to go there, but it's just my brain. But go back to my comment. It's just common sense. It's health. It's,
Right. Yeah, Larry?
I think many of us can, of the older people, can recall when all stores were closed on Sunday.
That's right.
You didn't go buy anything. And you can say, well, they're all open on Sunday now, but the workers aren't working 7 days.
No.
That store is staffed by people that are working 5 days a week. And they've just got enough people, so the store is open 7 days, but the people aren't working 7 days. So in essence, you can say we still honor that. It's just not that everybody gets Sunday off.
The labor unions have taken over with that.
Yeah. Pretty soon it's going to be 4 days, huh?
That was actually in the turn of the century, in the labor rights movement in the early 1900s. This is what was used. Like, there was a religious element to some of the labor rights things, and why they argued for a 5-day work week. Because, I mean, looking at the hours of like the women in the sewing or the textile mills and the seamstresses, they were working 16-hour days, 7 days a week. And so they said, you need a day of rest and a day of housework. Like, do the things to keep like the home running. And as anyone knows, like, just because you're not working a job doesn't mean you don't have work to do where you live. And so that's actually why we have the 2-day work or the 2-day weekend, is because one of the arguments was we need a day of rest. Even God rested. We are not better than God. God rested. We need rest. Yeah, Gary?
I don't think we should overlook the value of that day of rest from a mental standpoint, and an opportunity to self-analyze and refocus and refresh the mental side of the body. It's not just all physical.
I mean, 100% agree that sometimes your brain just needs a break from problem solving and to take a step back.
Right.
So the question is, what is absent from this commandment of the Sabbath day that is part of our association in the modern world of what it doesn't mean to take a Sabbath day?
Well, it doesn't talk about going to church or having a worship service.
No, it doesn't. It does not.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, really, it tells you what it means to celebrate a Sabbath is everything you don't do, but it doesn't tell you what to do. And this is where there's actually a lot of postulation that we've hit on in other parts of the Bible study, especially when we were discussing some of, if you see, Jesus kind of gave his fine-tuning interpretation of these in the Sermon on the Mount, which is why I keep referring back to that we studied a while back.
Mm.
But one of the things we talked about is building a fence around the Torah of like, don't break this commandment, but don't even come close to breaking this commandment, and this is how you do that. This is one of the commandments that it has a lot of discussion about, is like what counts as work. If the Sabbath day is holy and we want to keep it holy, how do we not work? And so some of the writing is, does it count as work to turn the lights on? And that's one of the things that is considered work because of the electricity and the power company. And because it's not just that you shouldn't work, it's that the people around you shouldn't make the people around you work either. And so it's extrapolated out, and it's connected with like, well, you're not supposed to make a fire in your fireplace. Like, that is considered work to make a fire, and turning on lights is kind of making a fire. So some practicing Jews have automated certain systems so they don't even have to like lift a finger to turn lights on or push elevator buttons. That's kind of how you can take it to the nth degree. But we tend to, as Christians, we don't tend to go that far with it. So the question is, how do we, I know we're over time already, but how do we tend to celebrate the Sabbath? Like, what makes things restful for us?
I think in many ways we've lost that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you think of, we've talked about the soccer games that are scheduled on Sundays, and kids sporting, and you know, the experience of the kids in a team sport kind of a thing has become primary in many families. And for the rest of us who have a time of worship on Sunday, I'm extrapolating that we don't spend the rest of the day resting. We visit, we shop, we do all these other things, but we don't dedicate the whole day.
I would even argue, if you have a part to play in worship, then you aren't resting. Then that's not, if you are worship leader, if you're doing coffee, then that's actually not a day of rest, because you're thinking about coming in and doing your job. I mean, famously, pastors work on Sundays, which means it will never be my day of rest. And so some of these things, I just put it to complicate it a little bit, but I think you're right. We, in this day and age, are very bad at resting. And yet this is a commandment that is in the positive tone. Do this. Yeah, Larry?
But certain people do take it seriously. I mean, most of us, we've got a day of rest because the office is closed. I don't have to work, quote, work. But we've replaced it with a whole host of activities that take up the entire day. But still, the Seventh-day Adventists, for example, they do not work. I mean, they sit on their front porch and I guess contemplate what's what. We had Adventists living next door to us. They did not lift a finger on Saturday.
Yeah. And in kind of reviving some of that, I do think it would be good to have, I think where we see this, the need for this is, or kind of, Gary, what you were saying is giving our brain a break, turning off the television, putting away your electronic devices, actually giving our brains a break from the constant onslaught of information. And so I try to have like a tech-free day. Not always good at it, good at that, but it's one of those that like giving my brain a break from just constantly ingesting and giving it a time to just be, even if it means we're bored. Boredom is sometimes helpful. And I wonder if we are so like addicted to new information or the news feeds or the news stations that we're actually not giving ourselves a chance to be bored. Yeah, Mary Ellen, though, I saw.
Well, I was, thinking of day of rest as we're thinking of it as physical rest. I would include in that mental rest. But also taking that day of rest, sitting on your front porch with your family. If the families use it in the way I'm thinking, it's a very positive thing. It's a time to strengthen your family ties. It's a chance to talk with each other and learn more than the basic hurry information. I know of a lot of situations where people play board games as families together, and don't just waste the time, but refocus the energies. And it can turn out to be a very positive thing if they choose to do it that way.
So that is actually a very Jewish understanding of this, is the Sabbath day is meant to be around family and doing things and building those relationships. Not to be too explicit, this comes from a professor who was Jewish and then converted to Christianity, but Sue, you met her.
Yes.
Dr. Ellen Cherry, I love her to pieces, but I remember we were talking about this in class, and one student asked a question, and her response is, "Oh yes, marital relations are very much encouraged on the Sabbath." Because it was seen as building relationship and that foundation. And there's a certain amount that's like, yes, it's restful, but that was one of the approved Sabbath activities, is to make sure that mom and dad are getting along and having time together.
It's what's the word? Mitzvah? There's a word that means doing a good thing.
Oh, yeah. So, all right. So thank you all for hanging well past 11. Any final thoughts? I'll adjust our reading calendar for the time coming up, and we can get to the second half of the 10 Commandments.
Okay. All right.
Any concluding thoughts for today? All right. Well, let us pray then. Good and gracious God, we come to you today looking at some of the instructions that you gave the people of Israel when you were making them your people. The instructions not just to how to live in good relationship with you, but how to live in good relationship with each other and with ourselves. We see that many of them have instructions of what not to do, and yet some of the instructions of what we should do, we still find difficult. We know that these things aren't just bad because morally they're bad, but you put them before us so that we could have life, and life abundantly, that our life might be full of joy and love and stability. So be with us as we continue to dwell on these 10 instructions you have, the core 10 you put before us for a good life. Help us see ways that we can continue to follow them, and maybe the ways that we struggle to. And so be with us as we continue to struggle, as we do things like learning how to rest, learning how to take you seriously, and learning how to put you first and foremost in our life, and weeding out the things that take up the time and the space and our attention that we often put before you. So I ask that you be with this group until we're able to gather again. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone.
Thanks, Chris.
Everybody have a great week.
All right.